Hiya guys, it's Stu Roberts again here, SD Roberts Plastering, Coventry. I wanted to shoot a quick video for you on a repair job that we're doing to a window header. So what's basically happened here is the customer's attempted to install a standard curtain rail, remove the old timber track, and unfortunately on removing the old timber track they've lost the total header above the window. So you can see here we've got a concrete lintel, quite a large concrete lintel, and some browning backing plaster, built in around the 70s this property was. So what we've had to do is, because they've lost the window reveal underneath and also the header along the top, we've cleaned it all back, we've exposed the lintel, and we've bonded on some new plasterboard to the reveal at the top there, and then we've just tacked a bead on, which just runs in nice and flush with the existing reveals on the edge there. So we've done that. We've used a polyurethane foam, sets in around 35-40 minutes, so it's ideal for repair work. It's got high bond strength as well, so we've just propped that in place, left it for 30 minutes. It's nice and solid now. Put the bead on, we've taped any joints in the plasterboard. I've just put a sealer on the masonry there, it's the PVA, just to seal the dust and create a nice bond for the backing plaster. And we're just about to apply the backing plaster now. So I'll set this up, we'll shoot a quick video of me applying the backing plaster, and I'll talk you through exactly what we're doing. So I've got a mixture of thistle bonding coat, which is going to go onto this masonry. Once that bonding coat's picked up, after around 30 minutes or so, we're going to apply the skim coat, which will blend into the existing plaster. So we'll start to apply this bonding coat now. Quite a firm mix, so obviously we need a decent thickness to this. We need around 10mm or 12mm. So it's always best when you're mixing it for these kinds of jobs, make sure you're not mixing it too wet, otherwise you might struggle to get that thickness that you need, and it might also start to sag if the mix is too wet. So nice and thick for small repair jobs like this. So we're just working it in, and we're using this bead at the bottom as a ruling point to get a nice straight edge to the backing plaster. So I'll continue to apply this bonding coat now right the way across the header, and we'll catch up once this bonding coat's firm, and I'll show you how to roll it up and float it up before we skim. Stay tuned. Alright guys, so that's the bonding plaster applied across the header there, the backing plaster, just quite rough, just trailed on roughly. So what we do now, once it's applied, we use this bead at the bottom that I mentioned that I tacked that on earlier, just to give me a nice a roll point now for the trowel. So once it's on roughly, the bottom section, we can just use the trowel just to smooth out any humps and bumps while it's picking up. And this will take around 20 or 30 minutes, maybe a bit less, to pick up a bit before we can skim. So we're going to use a straight edge along the ceiling line just to make sure it's nice and plumb. So I'll set the camera up now, and you can observe me doing that. I'll just talk you through it. So this is a lightweight alloy plaster straight edge. Fantastic fitter kit. Sometimes they might be called feather edges or derbies, whatever you want to call it. We call them straight edge. So it's important when you're plastering, even on small repairs, you try and keep your lines, all your ceiling lines, your skirting lines, and your corners nice and plumb and straight. You know, sometimes people might have coving and things like that. If you have got any discrepancies in the plaster line, especially along the ceiling, it'll really jump out and cause issues. For example, if you're going to install coving later on. So even on small repair works, try to keep an eye on your ceiling lines and keep them nice and straight. So on this job, for example, you'd use the narrow edge of your straight edge, and you just eye it in and just work it across from side to side, using the existing plaster either end as your rule point. So you just begin to slowly work it in. And the excess plaster that you have on your tool, with it being bonding coat, it should stick nicely. It's not going to, you know, fall on the floor and make mess. So you can leave it on until you finish ruling, and we'll scrape that off later on. If this was a sand and cement or hard wall mix, you'd have to continuously keep cleaning down your straight edge, otherwise you'd be absolutely everywhere by now. But with it being bonding coat, which is quite a sticky product, but the joy of it is you can keep working the straight edge, and it's not going to go anywhere. It'll just remain stuck to the straight edge. So again, we're going to use the existing plaster either side as our roll point to create a nice plumb straight header, just while this bonding coat picks up a bit. Okay, so that's how I use the straight edge. Stay tuned, and we'll move on to stage 3, which is floating. Stay with me. Okay chaps, so we've got our official bonding coat applied across this header. What I've done also is I've embedded some fiberglass reinforcing mesh right the way across the header here. You can see just behind the plaster here. And the idea of this stuff is it's like a crack resistant membrane that we embed into the backing plaster and sometimes into the skim coat as well. I've decided to do this on this particular repair because the customer is attempted to fix a new curtain rail, so he wants to put a piece of timber basically across this header for curtains, and which is what the drilling is what caused the previous plaster to fail. There are some cracks in the masonry behind there, nothing serious, but just a few stress cracks. So by embedding this mesh, it means obviously when he goes to drill again in the future, it'll just stop any dramas happening again. Basically it will stop the plaster from debonding from the masonry, and it will stop any hairline cracks as well. So it's a good product. So basically once your gear is starting to pick up a little bit, you trim your mesh with a knife to the size you need, and then you just literally work it into the plaster. And I'm just using my bead again there as a reference point for my straight edge, and you can completely embed the mesh and completely hide it, so that when the skim coat goes on, you won't see any mesh coming through there at all. Okay, so that's step 3 of this repair. We need to put some fiberglass mesh inside the plaster for extra strength. We've ruled that through now, really nice and plumb. The ceiling line's nice. So we just need to let that pick up a bit now. Then we're going to apply the skim coat. So stay tuned for the next phase, and we'll put some plaster skim on there. Before I forget, I mentioned about using a float earlier. I forgot to include that in the video, so I'm going to quickly run you through that now and just show you what I use the float for and when I use it. So these polyurethane floats, I've sort of made this smaller. They normally come a lot bigger than this. I use this one for small domestic jobs. It's just nice and nimble. It's not too clumsy. If you're doing a big gable end wall or something like that rendering, then obviously you'd use a big one. But for small repair works like this, I like to use this this small float here. So basically, the idea of the float is once you've ruled your backing plaster and it's picked up a bit, the gear's picked up, it's starting to go off. It's nice just to run the float across, especially across the ceiling lines, and it just gives that another level of flatness, and it compresses the material, so it gets it nice and flat. If there are any slight discrepancies where you've ruled off or you've troweled, it'll just lose those small discrepancies ready to take the skim coat. Normally you'd use a float for rendering sand and cement, for example. Is mainly where you use the float, but internal works, if we're doing hard wall or gypsum backing coats and things like that, we do finish the backing plaster with a float, and then we go on to use what we call a devil float as well, which we'll talk about that in another video, to create a key onto the backing plaster before we skim. So, but yeah, basically all you do once your materials start to pick up, just before you skim, we just run it through. We run it across all the way through along the ceiling lines, and because you're using a flat tool, completely flat onto the wall rather than the edge of your trowel, which can sometimes move the material around rather than compress it. The joy of using the float is that it's 100% flat and compressed. So again, probably a little bit over the top on this small job, but I like to do it. I always finish my backing coats with a float, just through habit, and it's a good working habit to get into, just to make sure you're keeping your work true and flat. So anyway, we'll get this skim coat mixed up now. The fiberglass mesh is in, it's completely bedded in, it's almost set, ready to take a skim. So we'll get the skim mixed up and you can watch us put this skim on. Okay guys, so I've mixed up the skim coat now. One thing I was going to mention, just before you do apply your skim, just take your wet brush, run it across your beads, the edge of your bead. What that'll do, it'll clean off any burrs that are left from the backing coat, and it'll just expose the last couple of mil of the edge of that bead, just so the bead will take the skim. So rather than your skim coat moving over the top of the edge of the bead, it will sit flush nicely within that lip. If you don't do that and your backing coat picks up a bit too much, you don't quite get a nice edge as you would if you would have brushed it all back. So always brush your work back just before you apply your first coat of skim. Brush all your edges, brush your ceiling line back. Again, just good practice. Makes everything else easier when you're troweling up later. Stops you picking up any burrs with your trowel, things like that. So, yeah, for the time it takes, it's well worth doing it. Okay, so we're going to start applying the skim coat now. So there'll be two tight coats going onto this backing plaster. And the reason you do two coats of skim is skim actually shrinks up on drying. So if you apply skim, multi-finish or board finish, whatever gypsum plaster it is, if you apply it too thin, sometimes it can crack. And also it can shell off when you paint and problems like that. So always apply two coats, whether that's two passes with the same mix, which I know some lads like to do. Personally, I like two separate mixes. So a first coat and then a fresh mix, and a tight coat at the end. Just gives a bit more time to get done what you need to. I mean, with a small repair like this, you could, with it being bonding coat as well, which is quite high suction, you can apply a tight coat, and then if it goes off fast enough, you can work it in again with the same mix. For bigger areas, we'd do 2 separate mixes of finish coat. But each to their own. I know guys that can get a really good finish by doing 2 passes with the same gear, the same mix. So, you know, if you're really quick and you've got good suction on the wall, then you can do that by all means. You can get a decent finish. So what we're looking to do here is get maybe between 1.5 to 2 mil thickness, and then this will pick up a little bit, and then we'll apply another one over the top, which will be maybe again 1 mil or so, maybe 2 mil, and then we're going to have a cup of tea and let that pick up. And then we can start polishing it up and get home for some dinner. So I'll carry on with this, and we'll catch up once the second coat's on and it's starting to cure, and then I can show you how we trowel it up. Okay guys, so we're coming towards the end of this plaster repair job in Coventry. And I'm just waiting for this last coat of multi-finish to pick up now before we can give the last couple of trowel ups, clean everything down and get the van loaded. So not far off. While it's going off, I thought I'd talk about why I chose bonding coat to run across the top of a header instead of just dot and dabbing a board on there, a 9mm board, which obviously would have been a lot easier. I wouldn't have had to use the straight edge or float anything, just dab it on, eye it up, and we could have cracked on. Normally we would do that. On this particular job we only had 6mm on the existing plaster line on this side. As it ran up towards the ceiling line, it narrowed right down to almost 5mm. So the other side we had around 12mm. So although we had plenty of depth on the left for a plaster board, for a 9mm board plus an adhesive bed, this side the plaster board would have been protruding by at least 4 or 5mm, which would have left a horrible bump along the ceiling line and also towards the bead. So although it would have been easier, we couldn't do it on this particular one, so that's why I chose to use thistle bonding coat this time, just to get it all walled in and squared up properly. Yeah, so that's why we use bonding coat here. I'm going to show you how we blend the new skim into the existing plaster there without creating a ridge or a seam where the two plaster lines meet, which can sometimes, if it's done wrong, it can sometimes leave horrible blemish once it's painted. So what we do is we just use our wet brush, the old faithful wet brush, and just clean fresh water. And what we do, we just wet the wall down and with the edge of the plaster skim line, and we wet it, and we're bleeding it into the existing plaster, which is very dry. You give it a good wet wee brush. You take your finished trowel, and the hard firm trowel, we're just working it back into the new plaster. Firm pressure. what that does, it leaves a nice flush seam, so there's no bump or ridge. So once that's all painted up, you won't see where it's joined. It'll be one seamless plaster finish as though it was originally. So again, we're just going to wet the edge with a wet brush onto that dry existing plaster. I'm going to work that with the trowel. Just to lose that ridge on the edge there. That's pretty much it. So that's this job more or less wrapped up. There's a bit of cleaning up to do on the edges. We're going to clean the place up, wash the window down, and this will need maybe 3 or 4 days to dry out fully before the customer can paint it up. But yeah, I hope you enjoyed this video, guys. I'll try and do a few more. I'm normally quite busy. If we're on a bigger job, I don't often get a chance to stop and record, but I will try harder. Yeah, hope you enjoyed it. See you on the next one. Cheers, guys.